The year was 1907, and the Lower East Side of Manhattan pulsed with the desperate rhythm of survival. In the shadow of towering tenements that blocked out most of the sun, families crammed into spaces barely fit for storage, their dreams as cramped as their living quarters. The air hung thick with the scent of boiled cabbage, unwashed bodies, and broken promises. It was here, in this maze of poverty and hope, that 8-year-old Sarah Levy learned that love could be as dangerous as hate. Sarah's world existed within four crumbling walls on the 3rd floor of a building that groaned under the weight of too many lives. The wallpaper, once decorated with tiny roses, now peeled in long strips that she and her siblings would pull at when hunger made their hands restless. Through paper-thin walls, they could hear Mrs. Kowalski arguing with her husband in Polish, the Martinelli baby crying through the night, and the constant shuffle of feet on creaking floorboards above their heads. The Levy children had learned to measure time not by the church bells that rang from the Catholic cathedral 6 blocks away, but by the sounds their father made. There was the heavy trudge of his work boots when he returned from the textile factory, back when he still had work. There was the lighter, unsteady stumble when he came home from Murphy's Tavern, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey and his eyes glazed with the kind of anger that looked for targets. And then there was the silence, the terrible, pregnant silence that meant he was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing, his leather belt coiled in his hands like a sleeping snake. Sarah had brown eyes that seemed too old for her face, eyes that had seen things no child should witness. Her dark hair was often tangled because there was rarely time for proper grooming when survival took precedence over appearance. She wore the same faded blue dress most days, a hand-me-down from some charitable organization that had long since moved on to helping other families. The dress was too big for her small frame, making her look even more fragile than she already was. But fragile was the last thing Sarah Levy could afford to be. At 8 years old, she had already appointed herself the protector of her younger siblings. Eli, just 6, with his father's stubborn jaw and their mother's gentle eyes, who still sometimes called out for mama in his sleep. Annie, barely 4, who had learned to suck her thumb silently because any sound could trigger their father's rage. Sarah had taught them both the art of invisibility, how to press themselves against walls when Papa came home angry, how to slow their breathing until it was almost silent, how to communicate with glances and tiny gestures that wouldn't draw attention. Their apartment consisted of 3 rooms, a kitchen that doubled as a living space, with a table that wobbled on uneven legs and 2 mismatched chairs, a bedroom where all 3 children slept on a single mattress stuffed with straw that poked through the worn fabric, and their father's room, which they were forbidden to enter. The kitchen window looked out onto an airshaft so narrow that if Sarah stretched her arm out, she could almost touch the brick wall of the building next door. Sometimes she would press her face against the grimy glass and crane her neck upward, trying to catch a glimpse of actual sky. The absence of their mother, Rebecca Levy, hung over the apartment like a shroud. She had disappeared 3 years ago on a night when the snow fell so thick it muffled even the usual sounds of the tenement. Sarah remembered waking up to find a piece of paper on the kitchen table, covered in the strange, flowing script of Yiddish that none of the children could read. Their father had crumpled it up and thrown it into the fire without explanation, but not before Sarah caught a glimpse of tear stains on the worn paper. In the months that followed their mother's departure, Sarah had pieced together fragments of overheard conversations between neighbors. Mrs. Goldstein from downstairs had whispered to Mrs. Chun that Rebecca Levy couldn't take any more of Jeb's drinking and his fists. The Italian woman from the 1st floor had clicked her tongue and said something about a woman having to choose between her children and her own life. But Sarah didn't understand how a mother could choose anything over her children, and the confusion and anger of that abandonment had settled into her bones like winter cold. Jeb Levy had not always been a monster. Sarah had dim memories of a different father, one who had lifted her onto his shoulders and pointed out ships in the harbor, who had brought home small pieces of candy wrapped in colorful paper, who had sung old Irish ballads in a voice that was rough but warm. That man had disappeared gradually, eroded away by unemployment, disappointment, and the bottom of too many bottles. The textile factory where he had worked for 7 years had closed down, taking with it not just his wages but his sense of purpose and pride. Now Jeb Levy was a hollow man filled with rage and self-loathing, and he poured both of those emotions onto his children with the regularity of a ritual. The leather belt he wore wasn't just a necessity to hold up his increasingly loose pants. It was an instrument of control, a way to ensure that his children feared him enough to stay in line. Sarah had counted the holes in that belt, had memorized the way it creaked when he pulled it tight, had learned to read the signs that meant it was coming off. The morning Sarah learned that bread could be a weapon, she was standing on a wooden crate trying to reach the top shelf of their kitchen cupboard. Her stomach had been empty for 2 days straight, gnawing at itself with a persistence that made her dizzy. Eli and Annie sat at the wobbling table, their eyes following her every movement with the desperate hope of children who had learned not to ask for what they needed but couldn't stop wanting it. The piece of stale rye bread she finally managed to grasp was hard as a rock and spotted with green mold, but Sarah's mouth watered at the sight of it. She had just begun to scrape off the worst of the mold with her fingernail when the apartment door slammed open with such force that it hit the wall and bounced back. Her father stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, his work clothes wrinkled and stained with substances she didn't want to identify. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jeb's voice was thick with alcohol and something darker, a rage that seemed to have been building for hours, maybe days. His bloodshot eyes fixed on the bread in Sarah's hands, and his face contorted with an anger so disproportionate to the offense that it frightened her more than his usual violence. "We're hungry, Papa," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She had learned long ago that speaking softly sometimes diffused his anger, though there was no predicting what would set him off or what might calm him down. "We haven't eaten since." The back of his hand caught her across the face before she could finish the sentence. The force of the blow knocked her off the crate, and she crashed to the floor, the bread flying from her hands and skittering across the dirty linoleum. The taste of blood filled her mouth, and her cheek throbbed with a pain that brought tears to her eyes. But Sarah had learned not to cry. Tears only made him angrier. "You think I don't know you're hungry?" Jeb's voice rose to a roar that seemed to shake the thin walls of the apartment. "You think I don't see the way you look at me? Like I'm some kind of failure who can't provide for his own children?" He was pulling off his belt now, the leather sliding through the loops of his pants with a sound that made all 3 children freeze with terror. Eli grabbed Annie's hand and pulled her toward the kitchen table, both of them scrambling underneath it like animals seeking shelter from a storm. Sarah wanted to join them, but her father's massive hand clamped down on her shoulder, holding her in place. The belt whistled through the air and struck her across the back, the pain sharp and immediate. She bit down on her lip hard enough to taste more blood, determined not to give him the satisfaction of hearing her scream. "This is what happens when you take what isn't yours," Jeb snarled, raising the belt again. "This is what happens when you act like you deserve something just because you want it." The second strike landed across her shoulders, and this time Sarah couldn't hold back a small whimper. The sound seemed to fuel his rage rather than satisfy it. From under the table, Eli and Annie watched with wide, terrified eyes. Annie had stuffed her thumb in her mouth and was sucking on it frantically, a habit their father usually tried to beat out of her. But now all his attention was focused on Sarah, who stood as straight as she could manage despite the pain radiating across her back and shoulders. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them, the walls pressing closer with each crack of the belt. The smell of unwashed bodies and stale alcohol filled the air, mixed with something else, the sour scent of fear and desperation that had become as much a part of their home as the peeling wallpaper and broken window latch. Through the thin walls, Sarah could hear Mrs. Kowalski's radio playing a Polish folk song, the cheerful melody a stark contrast to the violence unfolding just a few feet away. "You want to eat?" Jeb's voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow more frightening than his shouting. "You want to act like you deserve food?" He bent down and picked up the piece of moldy bread from the floor, brushing off some of the dirt and debris. "Then eat this. All of it." Sarah stared at the bread in his outstretched hand. It was covered in dust and grime from the floor, and the green mold had spread even further during its journey across the kitchen. Her stomach churned at the thought of putting it in her mouth, but she also knew that refusing would mean more pain for all of them. She took the bread with shaking hands and bit into it. The taste was awful sour and bitter, with a texture that seemed to dissolve into gritty particles on her tongue. But she chewed and swallowed, forcing herself not to gag, while her father watched with satisfaction. Eli and Annie remained huddled under the table, their small bodies pressed together for comfort and protection. "That's right," Jeb said, his voice taking on an almost gentle tone that was more disturbing than his anger. "You eat what you're given and you're grateful for it. You don't take what doesn't belong to you, and you don't act like you deserve better than what I can provide." When Sarah finished the last horrible bite, her father nodded once and walked toward his bedroom, leaving the children alone in the kitchen. The silence that followed was almost as oppressive as his presence had been. Sarah's back and shoulders burned where the belt had struck, and her stomach rolled with nausea from the rotten bread. But she forced herself to move toward the table where her siblings still cowered. "It's okay," she whispered, reaching under the table to touch Eli's hand. "He's gone now. It's okay." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't true. It wasn't okay, and it wouldn't be okay tomorrow or the day after that. This was their life, a constant cycle of fear, hunger, and violence from which there seemed to be no escape. 3 weeks after the bread incident, Sarah discovered that hope could arrive wearing the most unexpected faces. It was a Sunday morning when she first saw them, the woman with copper-red hair that caught the weak autumn sunlight like flames, and the tall, dignified man whose dark skin marked him as different in a neighborhood where different often meant dangerous. They stood outside the small synagogue on Hester Street, not as worshippers but as observers, watching the steady stream of families emerging from morning services with the patient attention of people who understood the value of waiting. The woman wore a simple brown dress that had been mended in several places but was scrupulously clean. Her shoes were worn but well cared for, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of someone who had known hardship but hadn't let it break her spirit. Her companion was even more striking, not just for his height, which made him tower over most of the crowd, but for the way he held himself. There was something in his posture that suggested military service, a straightness to his spine and a way of scanning his surroundings that spoke of someone accustomed to both authority and caution. Sarah had been sent to the synagogue not for religious reasons. The Levy family's relationship with faith had died along with their mother's departure, but because sometimes the charitable women who gathered there after services would hand out small packages of food to children who looked particularly thin. She had positioned herself across the street, trying to appear casual while keeping watch for any sign of generosity, when she noticed the unusual pair. What caught her attention first was the way they looked at the families emerging from the synagogue. It wasn't the casual glance of passers-by or the calculating stare of those looking for opportunity. Instead, their gazes lingered on the children with a longing so profound it was almost painful to witness. The woman's hand rested on her companion's arm, and Sarah could see her lips moving in quiet conversation, though she was too far away to hear the words. Clara Hoy, though Sarah wouldn't learn her name for several more days, had been standing outside synagogues and churches throughout the Lower East Side for the better part of 3 months. She and her husband Samuel had been married for 8 years, and for 7 of those years, they had tried to bring children into their lives. 3 pregnancies had ended in heartbreak, the last one nearly taking Clara's life along with the child she carried. The doctor who had saved her had also delivered the devastating news that she would never carry another pregnancy to term. The decision to seek children in need of homes had been Clara's, though Samuel had embraced it with the same quiet determination he brought to everything in his life. They had approached several agencies, only to be turned away with polite but firm rejections. An Irish Catholic woman married to a Negro man was not what these organizations considered suitable parents, regardless of their character or their ability to provide a loving home. Samuel Hoy had been born free in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith who had taught him both the trade and the importance of dignity in the face of prejudice. He had served with distinction in a colored regiment during the Spanish-American War, returning home with commendations and a deeper understanding of both the promise and the limitations of American justice. His marriage to Clara 5 years later had been a scandal in both their communities, but their love had proven stronger than social disapproval. Together, they had found work where they could, Samuel as a laborer in the shipyards, Clara taking in washing and mending, and had saved enough money to rent a small space in an abandoned mission house near the docks. The building had been damaged in a fire years earlier and never properly repaired, but it was dry and secure, and more importantly, it was theirs. They had spent months cleaning and fixing what they could, transforming the largest room into a simple but comfortable living space and setting aside 2 smaller rooms for the children they hoped to welcome. That Sunday morning, as they watched families emerge from the synagogue, Clara noticed a small figure across the street who seemed to be watching them with equal intensity. The child was thin to the point of gauntness, with dark hair that hung in tangles and clothes that were several sizes too large. But it was the eyes that caught Clara's attention, ancient eyes in a young face, eyes that had seen too much and expected too little. Sarah felt a strange flutter in her chest when the red-haired woman suddenly looked directly at her. For a moment, they stared at each other across the width of Hester Street, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that this stranger could see straight through to her soul. There was something in the woman's gaze that was different from the looks she usually received from adults. Not pity, not disgust, not the casual dismissal that poor children often faced, but something that looked almost like recognition. When the woman smiled and raised her hand in a small wave, Sarah's first instinct was to run. Strangers who paid attention to children like her rarely had good intentions. But something about the gesture, its gentleness, its complete lack of demand or expectation, kept her rooted to the spot. Instead of fleeing, she found herself taking a tentative step forward, then another, drawn by a curiosity stronger than her caution. Clara had nudged Samuel and nodded toward the child, and Sarah watched as they exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared understanding. When they began walking toward her, Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, but she didn't run. There was something about their approach, slow, non-threatening, with their hands visible and their movements deliberate, that reminded her of the way kind people approached stray cats, with patience and respect for the animal's fear. "Hello there," Clara said when they were close enough to speak without raising their voices. Her accent carried the soft lilt of Ireland, musical and warm. "I'm Clara, and this is my husband Samuel. We couldn't help but notice you watching the families. Are you waiting for someone?" Sarah hesitated, unsure how to answer. She was waiting, in a sense, waiting for an opportunity, waiting for kindness, waiting for something to change in her small, circumscribed world. But how could she explain that to strangers? How could she tell them that she spent most of her Sundays hoping someone would notice her hunger without her having to beg? "I'm Sarah," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I live nearby." It wasn't much of an explanation, but it was all she felt safe offering. Samuel crouched down to bring himself closer to her eye level, a gesture that surprised Sarah with its consideration. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Sarah," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "That's a beautiful name. Are you here with your family?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. Family, what did that word even mean anymore? Her father, who terrorized them daily. Her absent mother, who had chosen escape over protection. Her siblings, who depended on her for survival but whom she was failing to protect. She shook her head, not trusting her voice to remain steady. Clara and Samuel exchanged another look, and Sarah saw something pass between them. A decision being made, a choice to take a risk. "Sarah," Clara said gently, "Samuel and I have been hoping to meet children who might need friends. We have a place not far from here where there's always food and warm blankets, and where children are safe. Would you like to see it?" The night Sarah decided to run was the night her father came home with blood on his knuckles and madness in his eyes. It was past midnight when the apartment door crashed open, and she jolted awake on the straw mattress she shared with Eli and Annie. Through the thin wall that separated their sleeping space from the kitchen, she could hear him stumbling around, cursing in a mixture of English and the Irish Gaelic their mother had forbidden him to speak in front of the children. "Where are you, you little bastards?" His voice was slurred but filled with a rage that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Think you can hide from me in my own house?" There was the sound of furniture being overturned, dishes crashing to the floor, and then his heavy footsteps heading toward their room. Sarah's mind raced as she gently shook Eli and Annie awake, pressing her finger to her lips to signal silence. For 3 days, she had been planning this moment, ever since her conversation with Clara and Samuel outside the synagogue. They had given her their address, a mission house near the docks, and told her that if she and her siblings ever needed help, they should come there, day or night. Sarah had memorized the directions, walking the route twice during the daylight hours when her father was at Murphy's Tavern. "We have to go," she whispered to her siblings as their father's footsteps grew closer. "Right now. Remember what I told you about being quiet?" Eli nodded, his small face pale with fear, while Annie clutched her threadbare doll to her chest. Sarah had prepared them for this moment as best she could without terrifying them completely. She had told them they were going to play a game, a secret adventure where they had to be as quiet as mice and follow her exactly. She hadn't told them they might never come back. The window in their room was painted shut, but Sarah had been working at it for days with a bent spoon she had hidden under the mattress. The paint cracked as she pushed against the frame, and finally, it gave way with a groan that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The fire escape outside was rusted and treacherous, but it led down to the alley behind their building, away from the front entrance where their father might spot them. "Sarah." Annie. Jeb's voice was getting closer, and there was something in it that suggested this night was different from all the others. "Get out here right now, or I swear to God, I'll make you sorry you were ever born." Sarah helped Annie through the window first, the little girl's legs barely long enough to reach the fire escape platform. Eli followed, and then Sarah climbed through, pulling the window closed behind them as quietly as she could. The night air was cold and damp, with the promise of rain in the thick clouds that obscured the moon. The fire escape creaked ominously under their combined weight, but it held. They made their way down slowly, Sarah going first to test each step before allowing her siblings to follow. The metal was slick with moisture and years of accumulated grime, and more than once, Sarah's foot slipped, sending her heart racing. Behind them, through the thin walls of the tenement, they could hear their father's rage escalating as he discovered their empty room. The alley at the bottom of the fire escape was a maze of shadows and obstacles, overflowing garbage cans, abandoned crates, and puddles of water that reflected the occasional streetlight. Sarah had studied this route during her daylight reconnaissance, but everything looked different in the darkness. The familiar landmarks that had guided her before were now indistinct shapes that could have been anything. "This way," she whispered, taking Annie's hand while Eli gripped her other arm. They moved as quickly as they dared through the labyrinth of alleys that connected the Lower East Side tenements. Sarah had chosen this route specifically because it avoided the main streets where police officers walked their beats and where their father might think to look for them. The underground passages Sarah led them through were part of the city's forgotten infrastructure, old drainage tunnels, and abandoned basement connections that linked the older buildings. She had discovered them weeks earlier while exploring, driven by the restless energy that came from being trapped in their tiny apartment for too long. Now, these hidden pathways became their lifeline. The tunnels were pitch black and filled with the sounds of dripping water and skittering creatures that Sarah tried not to think about too carefully. She had brought a small candle stub and matches stolen from their kitchen, but she was saving them for when they had no other choice. For now, they moved by feel, Sarah's hand trailing along the damp brick walls while she guided her siblings through the darkness. "I'm scared," Annie whispered, her voice tiny and trembling. "I know, little bird," Sarah replied, using the pet name their mother had once called Annie. "But remember, this is our adventure. We're explorers, finding a secret treasure." She tried to keep her voice steady and reassuring, even though her own heart was pounding with terror and uncertainty. They had been walking for what felt like hours when they finally emerged from the tunnels near the docks. The smell of the harbor was strong here, salt water mixed with fish and tar and all the other scents of maritime commerce. In the distance, Sarah could see the masts of ships silhouetted against the cloudy sky, and she felt a surge of hope. They were close now, but as they made their way through the narrow streets near the waterfront, Sarah realized they were not alone. Behind them, she could hear footsteps echoing off the cobblestones, and when she turned to look, she caught a glimpse of a figure in the distance, too tall and too broad to be anyone but her father. "Run," she whispered urgently to Eli and Annie. "Run as fast as you can." They broke into a sprint, their small feet slapping against the wet stones as they raced through the maze of streets. Sarah's lungs burned with the effort, and she could hear Annie sobbing with exhaustion and fear. But they didn't stop. Behind them, their father's voice roared through the night, calling their names with a fury that promised terrible consequences if he caught them. The abandoned church appeared before them like a sanctuary, its Gothic spires reaching toward the dark sky. Sarah had found it during one of her exploratory walks, a building that had once served the Irish dock workers but had been abandoned when the congregation moved to a newer building uptown. The heavy wooden doors were chained shut, but Sarah had discovered a broken window on the side of the building that was just large enough for a child to squeeze through. She helped Annie and Eli through the window first, then followed them into the musty interior of the church. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the empty pews and the altar where a wooden cross still hung, draped in dust and cobwebs. It was here, in this forgotten house of God, that Clara found them an hour later. Sarah had been sitting in the front pew with her arms around her siblings, all three of them shivering from cold and exhaustion, when she heard footsteps in the aisle behind them. Her heart leaped with terror, thinking their father had somehow tracked them down, until she heard Clara's gentle voice calling her name. "Sarah? Are you here, child? It's Clara and Samuel. We've been looking for you." The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense it left her dizzy. She turned to see Clara approaching with a lantern in her hand and Samuel close behind her, both of them moving slowly and carefully so as not to frighten the children. Clara was carrying a basket that smelled of warm bread and soup, and Samuel had an armful of thick blankets. "How did you find us?" Sarah asked, her voice hoarse from their flight through the tunnels. Clara smiled gently as she knelt beside the pew. "A neighbor saw 3 children running through the streets and thought they might be in trouble. We've been checking every place we could think of where frightened children might hide." She reached out slowly to touch Sarah's face, her fingers gentle on the bruise that had formed their days earlier. "Are you hurt? Are your brother and sister all right?" For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to cry, not the silent tears she had learned to shed in hiding, but the deep, wrenching sobs of a child who had finally found safety. 5 days of peace was all they were allowed before the past came knocking with the force of law behind it. Sarah woke that Tuesday morning to the sound of Annie giggling in the kitchen, a sound so foreign and wonderful that for a moment she thought she might still be dreaming. Through the window of the small room Clara and Samuel had prepared for them, she could see genuine sunlight streaming in, not the thin, filtered light that had struggled through the airshaft of their old tenement, but real, warm sunshine that painted golden rectangles on the clean wooden floor. The mission house had been transformed by Clara and Samuel's care into something Sarah had never experienced before. A true home. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and gathering space, with a large table that Samuel had built himself from salvaged ship timber. The walls were painted a cheerful yellow that Clara had mixed herself, and she had sewn curtains from fabric remnants donated by a sympathetic shop owner. There were books on shelves, actual books that the children were encouraged to touch and read, and a small piano that Clara played in the evenings, filling the space with melodies that chased away the darkness. Sarah had spent the previous 4 days in a state of cautious wonder, unable to quite believe that this safety was real. She had watched Clara prepare meals without anger, seen Samuel listen to Eli's endless questions with patience and genuine interest, observed Annie slowly emerge from her shell of silent terror. For the first time since their mother's departure, Sarah had allowed herself to sleep deeply, without one ear listening for the sound of footsteps that might herald danger. But that Tuesday morning, as she padded barefoot toward the kitchen where she could hear Clara humming an Irish folk song, the sound of heavy knocking on the front door froze her blood. It wasn't the gentle rap of a neighbor or the respectful knock of someone seeking help. This was the authoritative pounding of someone who expected immediate compliance, someone accustomed to doors opening at their command. Clara's humming stopped abruptly, and Sarah heard Samuel's chair scrape across the floor as he rose from the table. Through the thin walls of the mission house, voices could be heard from outside men's voices, official and demanding. "Open up in there. Police business." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she crept toward the kitchen doorway. Clara was standing perfectly still beside the stove, her face pale but determined, while Samuel moved toward the front door with the measured steps of a man preparing for battle. Eli and Annie had frozen at the table, their breakfast of oatmeal and honey forgotten, their eyes wide with the particular terror of children who had learned that official authority rarely brought anything good. Samuel opened the door slowly, and Sarah could see past him to the figures standing on their small porch. There were 3 men. A police officer in uniform, his brass buttons gleaming in the morning sun. A thin, nervous-looking man in a dark suit who clutched a leather satchel. And behind them both, swaying slightly but unmistakably present, Jeb Levy. Sarah's father looked terrible. His clothes were rumpled and stained. His face unshaven and haggard. His eyes bloodshot from drink and sleepless nights. But there was something else in his expression. Something that might have been genuine anguish if Sarah hadn't learned long ago not to trust any emotion from him that wasn't rage. "These are my children," Jeb said. His words slightly slurred but his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "They were taken from my home illegally, and I want them back." The police officer, a heavy-set Irish man with graying whiskers, looked uncomfortable with his role in the proceedings. "Mr. Hoy, is it? I'm Officer Murphy. We have a complaint here from Mr. Levy stating that his children are being held against their will on these premises." Samuel stood straighter, every inch of his considerable height radiating dignity despite the circumstances. "Officer Murphy, these children came to us seeking help. They were hungry, frightened, and in need of care. We have provided them with food, shelter, and safety." "That's kidnapping," the nervous man in the dark suit interjected, pulling papers from his satchel. "I'm Harold Finch from the city attorney's office. Mr. Levy has legal custody of these children, and they must be returned to him immediately." From her hiding place in the doorway, Sarah could see Clara's hands clenched into fists at her sides. When she spoke, her voice was steady but filled with a controlled fury that Sarah had never heard from her before. "Those children bear the marks of abuse," Clara said clearly. "Sarah has bruises on her face and back. They were starving when they arrived here. What kind of father allows his children to go hungry?" Jeb's face flushed red with anger and what might have been shame. "I've had hard times, but they're my blood, my responsibility. No court in this city is going to give my children to—" He gestured dismissively at Samuel and Clara, his meaning clear without him having to speak the ugly words. Officer Murphy shifted uncomfortably, his gaze moving between the adults and occasionally darting toward the interior of the house where he could undoubtedly sense the presence of the children. Sarah had heard enough stories from the neighborhood to know that Irish cops like Murphy understood something about poverty and desperation, even if they didn't always know what to do about it. "Now, Mr. Levy," Murphy said slowly, "these are serious allegations you're making, but these are also serious counter-allegations being made against you. Maybe we should take a step back here and think about what's best for the children." It was then that Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She stepped out from behind the doorway and walked deliberately toward the front door, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Behind her, she could hear Eli and Annie scrambling down from their chairs, following her with the instinctive loyalty they had learned during their years of shared survival. "Hello, Papa," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying none of the fear that had once characterized every interaction with her father. Standing there in the safety of the mission house, with Clara and Samuel flanking her like protective guardians, she felt something she had never experienced before in her father's presence. A sense of her own power. Jeb Levy stared at his eldest daughter, and Sarah could see him taking in the changes that 5 days of proper care had wrought. Her hair was clean and neatly braided, courtesy of Clara's patient ministrations. Her face had filled out slightly from regular meals, and the constant tension that had once held her small body rigid had eased. She stood straighter, looked directly at him instead of keeping her eyes downcast. And when she spoke, her voice carried a quiet confidence that he had never heard from her before. "We're not coming back," Sarah said simply. "We're safe here. We're fed here. Nobody hurts us here." The silence that followed her words stretched taut as a wire. Officer Murphy looked from Sarah to her father and back again, his weathered face creased with the kind of moral complexity that beat cops encountered daily but were rarely equipped to solve. Harold Finch rustled his papers nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation was developing. It was Samuel who finally broke the silence, his deep voice carrying the authority of a man who had faced down worse enemies than a drunken abuser and a nervous city attorney. "Officer Murphy," Samuel said formally, "I served with the 10th Cavalry in Cuba. I know something about duty and about protecting those who cannot protect themselves. These children came to us in distress, and we will not see them return to harm." Murphy's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of the 10th Cavalry. Even Irish cops knew the reputation of the Buffalo Soldiers. The nervous attorney, however, was less impressed with military credentials than with legal ones. "This is highly irregular," Finch said, consulting his papers again. "Mr. Levy has parental rights that supersede any temporary arrangements you may have made. Without a court order, you have no legal standing to keep these children." Clara stepped forward then, her Irish accent thickening with emotion. "And what court is going to listen to the word of a Negro man and an Irish woman against a white father, no matter what kind of father he is?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, forcing everyone present to confront the uncomfortable realities of justice in 1907 New York. Murphy's face reddened, whether from anger or embarrassment. Sarah couldn't tell. "I'll tell you what," Murphy said finally, his voice gruff with the weight of compromise. "I'll give you folks until the end of the week to sort this out proper-like. Mr. Levy, you go see about getting yourself cleaned up and finding some steady work. Mr. and Mrs. Hoy, you see about getting yourselves some legal representation. Come Friday, we'll revisit this situation with clearer heads." It wasn't a victory, but it wasn't defeat either. As the three men walked away from the mission house, Sarah felt Clara's hand settle gently on her shoulder, warm and reassuring and absolutely steady. Sarah's plan formed during the long, sleepless hours of Wednesday night, as she lay listening to Annie's peaceful breathing and Eli's soft snores. The weight of responsibility that had shaped her young life hadn't disappeared with their escape to the mission house. If anything, it had crystallized into something sharper and more focused. She understood, with the clarity that sometimes comes to children who have been forced to think like adults, that running away had been only the first step. To truly be free, she would have to confront the source of their terror directly. Thursday afternoon, while Clara was teaching Annie how to knead bread dough and Samuel was showing Eli how to plane a piece of wood, Sarah slipped out of the mission house. She had told no one of her intentions, knowing that the adults who had come to care for them would never allow an 8-year-old girl to venture alone into the heart of the Lower East Side's drinking district. But Sarah had learned long ago that sometimes the only way to protect the people you love is to take risks they would never ask you to take. The walk to Murphy's Tavern on the Bowery took her through streets that felt both familiar and foreign. These were the same cobblestones she had walked countless times, the same tenements rising like brick cliffs on either side, the same smells of cooking food and unwashed bodies and industrial smoke that had formed the backdrop of her entire life. But now, instead of moving through this landscape as a victim, she walked with purpose. Her small frame still made her nearly invisible among the crowds of workers and street vendors, but her invisibility had become a weapon rather than a vulnerability. Murphy's Tavern was exactly as she remembered it from the few times her mother had sent her to fetch her father home for dinner, back when such domestic rituals still existed in their household. The building was narrow and dark, squeezed between a pawn shop and a boarding house, with windows so grimy that no light penetrated from the street. The wooden sign hanging above the door had once been painted green, but years of weather and neglect had faded it to the color of old moss. Sarah pushed through the heavy wooden door and was immediately assaulted by the familiar cocktail of smells that characterized her father's second home. Stale beer, unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, and something else, the sour scent of dreams that had curdled into bitterness. The interior was lit by a few gas lamps that cast wavering shadows across the rough wooden tables, and the men hunched over their drinks. She found Jeb Levy where she had expected to find him, slumped at a corner table with his back to the wall, a half-empty bottle of whiskey before him and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished somehow by the enormity of his failure as a father and a man. His clothes were the same ones he had worn to the mission house the day before, now even more wrinkled and stained, and his unshaven face had the gray pallor of someone who had been drinking steadily for days. Sarah approached his table slowly, her small feet making no sound on the sawdust-covered floor. Several of the other patrons glanced at her with curiosity. Children were not entirely uncommon in establishments like Murphy's, but they usually came as messengers or beggars, not as solitary figures moving with such obvious determination. "Hello, Papa," she said quietly, sliding onto the wooden bench across from him. Jeb's head jerked up, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus. For a moment, he seemed unable to comprehend what he was seeing, as if his daughter were an apparition conjured by guilt and alcohol. When recognition finally dawned, his face cycled through a series of emotions: surprise, anger, something that might have been relief, and finally a kind of defeated exhaustion. "Sarah," he said, her name coming out as little more than a croak. "What are you doing here? You should be at home." "I don't have a home, Papa," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "You made sure of that." The words hit him like physical blows, and she watched as he flinched and reached for his bottle with shaking hands. He took a long drink, as if the whiskey could wash away the truth of what she had said, then set the bottle down with exaggerated care. "I never meant," he began, then stopped, seeming to realize that intentions mattered less than actions, especially when it came to the welfare of children. "I've had a hard time, Sarah. Since your mother left, since I lost my job, everything's been..." "Everything's been what?" Sarah interrupted, leaning forward across the scarred wooden table. "Hard for you? Do you think it's been easy for us? Do you think Eli and Annie and I have been having a grand time while you drank yourself stupid and beat us for being hungry?" Her voice had risen slightly, drawing glances from nearby tables, but Sarah no longer cared who heard. This conversation had been building inside her for years, every harsh word and cruel blow adding to the pressure, and now it was finally finding release. "I'm your father," Jeb said weakly, as if the biological fact alone conferred some kind of moral authority. "I brought you into this world. I have rights." "Rights?" Sarah's laugh was bitter and sharp, a sound that should never have come from a child's throat. "What about our rights, Papa? What about our right not to be beaten? Our right to eat? Our right to feel safe in our own beds?" Jeb stared at her, and Sarah could see something breaking behind his eyes. Whether it was his last vestige of self-justification or simply his will to fight, she couldn't tell. But when he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more defeated. "What do you want from me, Sarah?" She had come prepared for this question, had rehearsed her answer during the long walk through the city streets. Reaching into the pocket of her dress, she pulled out a folded piece of paper, one of the legal documents that Harold Finch had waved around so importantly the day before, which she had managed to glimpse while the adults were arguing. "I want you to sign this," she said, smoothing the paper on the table between them. "I want you to give up your legal claim to us. I want you to let Clara and Samuel adopt us properly, so that no one can ever take us away from them again." Jeb stared at the document as if it were written in a foreign language. "I can't. Sarah, you don't understand. A man doesn't just give up his children. A man doesn't beat his children either," Sarah replied. "A man doesn't let them go hungry while he spends their food money on whiskey. A man doesn't make them so afraid that they have to run away in the middle of the night to feel safe." She leaned back and studied her father's face, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in her life. Without the filter of fear that had colored every previous interaction, she could see that Jeb Levy was not a monster. He was simply a broken man who had never learned how to put himself back together, and who had made his children pay the price for his brokenness. "You know what the funny thing is, Papa?" Sarah said, her voice growing gentler. "I used to lie awake at night trying to remember the good times, when you would carry me on your shoulders, or when you would sing those old songs Mama taught you. I tried so hard to hold on to those memories, to believe that somewhere inside the angry man who hurt us, there was still the father who used to love us." Jeb's eyes filled with tears, and his hands shook as he reached for his bottle again. But Sarah's small hand shot out and covered his, stopping him. "Don't," she said simply. "For once in your life, don't hide behind the drink. Look at me, Papa. Really look at me. Do you see a happy child? Do you see a daughter who feels loved and protected? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of other conversations and the clink of bottles against glasses. Finally, Jeb lifted his gaze to meet hers, and Sarah saw her answer in his eyes long before he spoke. "No," he whispered. "I see a little girl who's had to grow up too fast because her father failed her." Sarah nodded, feeling no satisfaction in the admission, only a deep sadness for all the ways their family had been broken. "Then let us go, Papa. Let us be happy with people who know how to love children without hurting them." Jeb Levy sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the legal document on the table. Then, without another word, he picked up a pencil from behind his ear and signed his name at the bottom of the page. The signed document might have been a victory, but Sarah quickly learned that her father's surrender was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The New York City family court system in 1907 was not designed to accommodate the kind of unconventional family that Clara and Samuel were proposing to create. When they appeared before Judge Harrison Whitmore on the following Monday morning, they carried with them not only Jeb Levy's signed relinquishment of parental rights, but also a mountain of evidence that would challenge every assumption the court held about suitable parents. The courtroom was a temple to masculine authority, with its high ceilings, dark wood paneling, and imposing bench from which Judge Whitmore presided like a stern patriarch. Sarah, Eli, and Annie sat in the front row of the gallery, their small forms dwarfed by the formal proceedings unfolding before them. Sarah had insisted on being present despite Clara's gentle suggestions that children might be better served waiting outside. She had come too far and risked too much to be excluded from the final determination of their fate. Judge Whitmore was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested he had seen every variation of human failing that could be brought before his court. His initial reaction to the Hoy's petition was written clearly on his face. Skepticism bordering on disbelief. An interracial couple seeking to adopt 3 white children was unprecedented in his experience, and precedent was the foundation upon which his entire worldview rested. "Mr. and Mrs. Hoy," Judge Whitmore began, consulting the papers before him with the careful attention of a man accustomed to finding flaws in even the most carefully prepared cases. "I see here that you are requesting legal guardianship of the Levy children. I also see that Mr. Levy has signed a document relinquishing his parental rights. What I do not see is any compelling evidence that you are suitable parents for these children." Samuel rose from his seat at the plaintiff's table, his military bearing evident in the straight line of his shoulders and the measured way he addressed the court. "Your Honor, my wife and I have provided these children with food, shelter, safety, and affection for the past 2 weeks. In that time, they have shown remarkable improvement in both their physical health and their emotional well-being." "That may be true, Mr. Hoy," the judge replied, "but temporary care and permanent guardianship are entirely different matters. The court must consider not only the immediate welfare of these children, but their long-term prospects for successful integration into society. I must ask, what kind of future can you realistically provide for 3 white children in a household headed by a Negro man?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Sarah felt her heart sink as she recognized the fundamental prejudice they were facing. This was not simply about her father's fitness as a parent or Clara and Samuel's ability to provide care. This was about the rigid social hierarchies that determined who belonged where in American society. Clara rose to stand beside her husband, her Irish accent lending a musical quality to her words even as her meaning was deadly serious. "Your Honor, respectfully, I would ask what kind of future these children could expect if they are returned to their father or placed in one of the city's institutions. Sarah bears the physical marks of abuse, and all 3 children show signs of chronic malnutrition. My husband and I may not be able to change the color of our skin or the prejudices of society, but we can promise these children love, stability, and safety." Judge Whitmore frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the direct challenge to his implied assumptions. "Mrs. Hoy, the court appreciates your passion for these children. However, passion alone does not qualify one for parenthood. What proof can you offer that you and your husband possess the moral character, financial stability, and social standing necessary to raise these children properly. It was then that their lawyer, a young Jewish man named David Goldstein who had taken their case primarily as a favor to Samuel's former commanding officer, stood and gestured toward the gallery behind them. "Your Honor, if I may call witnesses to speak to the character and capabilities of my clients?" What followed was a parade of testimony that painted a picture of the Hoys that challenged every stereotype the court might have held. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, the elderly white woman who owned the boarding house where Clara had worked as a seamstress, testified to Clara's honesty, work ethic, and gentle manner with the children who lived in the building. She spoke of finding Clara reading stories to a group of neighborhood children, of her skill in nursing sick tenants back to health, and of her unwavering loyalty to those who earned her trust. Captain William Morrison, Samuel's former commanding officer in the 10th Cavalry, appeared in his dress uniform to testify to Samuel's courage under fire, his leadership abilities, and his unshakable moral character. He described Samuel's actions during the Battle of Las Guasimas, where he had risked his own life to save wounded comrades, and spoke of the respect he had earned from both his fellow soldiers and his superior officers. Perhaps most compelling was the testimony of Miss Margaret Sullivan, a schoolteacher at the local public school who had been observing the Levy children since their arrival at the mission house. She described the dramatic changes she had witnessed in their behavior and demeanor: Sarah's increasing confidence and willingness to speak in class, Eli's emerging curiosity about books and learning, Annie's gradual emergence from the shell of silence that had protected her from trauma. "Your Honor," Miss Sullivan said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years working with children from all backgrounds. "I have seen many children who have suffered abuse and neglect. The transformation I have witnessed in these 3 children is nothing short of remarkable. They are thriving under the care of Mr. and Mrs. Hoy in ways that would be impossible if they were not receiving genuine love and attention." But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source. Dr. Benjamin Cohen, the physician who had examined the children upon their arrival at the mission house, presented detailed medical evidence of the abuse they had suffered under their father's care. He described the pattern of bruises on Sarah's back and arms, the signs of chronic malnutrition in all 3 children, and the psychological symptoms that indicated prolonged exposure to trauma. "In my professional opinion," Dr. Cohen stated, looking directly at Judge Whitmore, "removing these children from the care of Mr. and Mrs. Hoy would constitute a form of medical malpractice. They are receiving the kind of comprehensive care, physical, emotional, and spiritual, that is essential for their recovery from severe trauma." Judge Whitmore listened to each witness with growing discomfort, his initial certainty about the impropriety of the adoption clearly wavering under the weight of evidence. But it was Sarah herself who delivered the final argument that would sway his decision. "Your Honor," she said, rising from her seat in the gallery without permission, her clear young voice carrying across the courtroom. "May I speak?" The judge looked startled by the interruption, but after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. "Very well, child. What would you like to say?" Sarah walked to the front of the courtroom, her small figure dwarfed by the formal surroundings but her presence commanding attention nonetheless. "Your Honor, I know that Clara and Samuel are different from other families. I know that some people will always see us as strange or wrong. But I also know that for the first time in my life, I go to sleep at night without being afraid. I know that my brother and sister are learning to laugh again. I know that we are loved." She paused, looking directly at the judge with the same unwavering gaze that had faced down her father in Murphy's Tavern. "You asked what kind of future Clara and Samuel can give us. I think the better question is, what kind of future would we have without them?" The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Sarah's words settling over everyone present like a benediction. Judge Whitmore stared at the 8-year-old girl who had just delivered a more compelling argument than many of the lawyers who appeared before his bench, and Sarah could see the exact moment when his resolve crumbled. "The court," Judge Whitmore said slowly, his voice carrying a gravity that acknowledged the precedent he was about to set, "hereby grants legal guardianship of Sarah, Eli, and Annie Levy to Mr. Samuel Hoy and Mrs. Clara Hoy. May God have mercy on us all if we are making a mistake." But as Sarah ran toward Clara and Samuel, feeling their arms close around her in an embrace that promised permanence and safety, She knew with absolute certainty that this was no mistake. This was salvation. 3 months after the court ruling that officially made them a family, the mission house echoed with a sound that had become as familiar as morning prayers. The laughter of children who were learning what it meant to feel secure. Sarah woke each day to the smell of Clara's Irish soda bread baking in the oven and the sound of Samuel's deep voice reading aloud from whatever book had captured his interest the night before. The rhythm of their new life had settled into something that felt both miraculous and utterly natural. It was on a particularly cold February morning that their family expanded again, not through official channels or legal proceedings, but through simple human compassion. Sarah was helping Clara hang laundry in the small courtyard behind the mission house when they heard it. A baby's cry, thin and desperate, cutting through the winter air like a blade. The sound was coming from the alley that ran along the side of their building, and Clara and Sarah followed it to its source with the kind of urgency that mothers, biological or chosen, understand instinctively. They found her huddled against the brick wall of the neighboring building. A girl who couldn't have been more than 16, with dark hair hanging in lank strands around her face and a bundle of rags pressed against her chest from which emerged tiny fists and the wailing that had drawn them outside. The girl's name was Maisie Finn, and her story poured out of her in a torrent of Italian-accented English mixed with tears of exhaustion and desperation. She had arrived in New York 6 months earlier with her family, part of the great wave of Southern Italian immigration that was transforming neighborhoods throughout the city. Her parents had arranged a marriage for her with the son of another immigrant family, a union designed to strengthen business ties and ensure financial security for both households. But Maisie had fallen in love with someone else, a young Irish dockworker named Patrick who treated her with kindness and respect, who made her laugh and dream of a future built on affection rather than obligation. When she discovered she was carrying Patrick's child, she had tried to tell her parents, hoping they would understand, hoping they would choose her happiness over their business arrangements. Instead, they had thrown her out of their home with nothing but the clothes on her back and the pronouncement that she was no longer their daughter. The man she loved had been beaten by her brothers and warned never to see her again under penalty of death. She had been wandering the streets for 3 days, sleeping in doorways and begging for scraps of food, when the first pains of labor had begun. "I had her in a basement," Maisie whispered, her voice barely audible above the baby's cries. "All alone, with just some old newspapers and a rusty knife to cut the cord. I didn't know it would hurt so much, or that there would be so much blood." Clara took the baby from Maisie's arms with the practiced ease of someone who had always been meant to nurture children, examining the tiny form with careful attention. The infant was smaller than she should have been, with the gray pallor of malnutrition, but her cries were strong and her eyes were bright with the fierce will to survive that Clara recognized in all the strays who found their way to the mission house. "What's her name?" Clara asked gently, rocking the baby with an automatic motion that seemed to calm both child and mother. "Rose," Maisie said, reaching out to touch her daughter's tiny hand. "I wanted to call her Rose because even in the darkest places, roses can grow." Sarah watched this exchange with the fascination of someone who was witnessing the expansion of everything she understood about family. In the space of a few minutes, their household had grown by 2, and she could see in Clara's face that there was never any question about what would happen next. This was what love looked like in action. Immediate, unquestioning, transformative. Samuel's reaction when they brought Maisie and baby Rose inside was everything Sarah had hoped it would be. He took one look at the exhausted girl and the hungry infant and began moving with the quiet efficiency that had made him an effective soldier and now made him an effective father. Within an hour, he had prepared a warm bath for Maisie, found clean clothes that had been donated to their informal charity network, and rigged up a makeshift cradle for Rose using a wooden crate and some of Clara's softest blankets. "But where will we put them?" Eli asked, his 6-year-old mind focused on the practical logistics of their suddenly expanded family. "We don't have enough beds." Samuel smiled at the question, already mentally redesigning the mission house's layout to accommodate their new residents. "We'll make room," he said simply. "That's what families do." And they did make room in ways both physical and emotional. Samuel spent his evenings after work from the shipyard building a small addition to the mission house, using salvaged materials and volunteer labor from neighbors who had come to respect what the Hoys were creating. Clara taught Maisie the skills she would need to survive in their new country: how to read English, how to navigate the city's bureaucracy, how to find work that would allow her to support herself and her daughter with dignity. But perhaps most importantly, they made emotional room for the particular kind of healing that Maisie needed. Sarah watched with fascination as Clara helped the young mother understand that her worth was not determined by her parents' approval or her community's judgment. Night after night, as baby Rose slept in her makeshift cradle, Clara and Maisie would sit by the fire talking in low voices about dreams deferred and futures reclaimed. "I used to sew," Maisie confided one evening, her fingers working automatically to mend a tear in one of Eli's shirts. "Back in Sicily, I made dresses for the women in our village. Beautiful dresses with flowers embroidered on the bodices and skirts that moved like water when you walked." Clara leaned forward with interest. "Do you think you could teach us? Sarah has been wanting to learn needlework, and I never had the patience for fancy stitching." What followed was a series of evening lessons that transformed the main room of the mission house into an impromptu workshop. Maisie's skilled hands guided Sarah through the basics of embroidery, teaching her how to create tiny flowers and delicate leaves that seemed to bloom under her needle. Annie, though still too young for complex needlework, learned to sort threads by color and help wind bobbins, her small fingers surprisingly deft at the detailed work. These sewing sessions became a form of therapy for all of them, a way of creating beauty in a world that had shown them too much ugliness. Sarah found that the repetitive motion of stitching helped quiet the anxious thoughts that still sometimes kept her awake at night, while Maisie discovered that teaching her skills to others gave her a sense of purpose that she had been missing since her exile from her family. As winter gave way to spring, their expanded family settled into new routines that accommodated everyone's needs and contributions. Maisie found work with a dressmaker in Little Italy, her skills with needle and thread earning her enough money to contribute to the household expenses and save toward eventual independence. Clara and Samuel never asked for payment for room and board, but Maisie insisted on contributing what she could, understanding that dignity required some measure of self-sufficiency. The children adapted to their new family member with the resilience that had helped them survive their father's abuse. Eli appointed himself Rose's unofficial protector, insisting on testing her formula temperature and checking her blankets multiple times each night. Annie found in baby Rose the living doll she had always dreamed of, spending hours singing lullabies and making faces that would coax smiles from the infant. But it was Sarah who formed the strongest bond with Maisie, perhaps because she recognized in the young mother the same fierce protective instinct that had driven her own actions throughout their ordeal. They would sit together in the evenings, Sarah helping with the mending, while Maisie worked on more elaborate pieces that she hoped to sell to supplement her income. And in their quiet conversations, Sarah began to understand that there were many different ways to be strong. The piece they had built together lasted exactly 9 months before the past came knocking again, this time wearing a different face but carrying the same toxic intentions. Sarah was hanging wash in the courtyard on a humid August morning when she saw him. A thin, nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, standing at the mouth of the alley and staring at their building with the calculating gaze of someone taking inventory. Something about his posture, the way he lingered without approaching, sent a chill of recognition through her body despite the summer heat. She had learned to trust these instincts, these sudden flashes of alarm that had kept her and her siblings alive during the worst days with their father. Without taking her eyes off the stranger, she backed toward the mission house's rear entrance, her mind already cataloging the locations of everyone she needed to protect. Clara was inside kneading bread for the evening meal. Samuel was at the shipyard and wouldn't return until sunset. Maisie was at the dressmaker's shop with baby Rose, and Eli and Annie were playing in the front room with a set of wooden blocks Samuel had carved for them. The man in the alley pulled out a pocket watch, consulted it with exaggerated care, then walked around to the front of the building. Sarah followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows cast by the neighboring buildings, every nerve in her body screaming that this was the beginning of something terrible. She reached the front window just as the knocking began, not the authoritative pounding of police officers or the desperate hammering of someone in genuine need, but a measured, deliberate sound that suggested someone who expected to be invited in. Clara opened the door with the same welcoming smile she offered to everyone who came to their threshold, but Sarah could see her expression change as she took in their visitor's appearance. "Mrs. Hoy?" the man said, removing his hat to reveal thinning hair plastered to his scalp with pomade. "My name is Thomas Levy. I believe you have my brother's children in your care." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. Thomas Levy. She remembered him now, though she hadn't seen him since she was very small. He was Jeb's younger brother, a man who had always made her skin crawl even when she couldn't articulate why. Where Jeb's violence was explosive and unpredictable, Thomas had always struck her as someone whose cruelty would be calculated and methodical. "Mr. Levy," Clara said carefully, not inviting him inside but not closing the door either. "I wasn't aware that Jeb had a brother. The children have never mentioned you." Thomas smiled, but there was nothing warm or genuine in the expression. "We've been estranged for some years. Family disputes, you understand. But now that poor Jeb has passed away, God rest his soul, it falls to me as their closest blood relative to take responsibility for Sarah, Eli, and Annie." Sarah's gasp was audible even through the window, and she saw Clara's hand tighten on the door frame. Their father was dead? When had this happened? How had Thomas found out about their situation when they had been living quietly at the mission house for nearly a year? "I'm sorry for your loss," Clara said slowly, though Sarah could hear the suspicion in her voice. "When did Jeb pass?" "We hadn't heard." "3 weeks ago," Thomas replied, pulling a folded document from his jacket pocket. "Consumption, the doctor said, though between you and me, I think it was more the drink that killed him. Found him in his room at Mrs. O'Malley's boarding house, dead for 2 days before anyone thought to check on him." The image hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her father, dying alone and unmourned in a stranger's room, with no one to hold his hand or whisper forgiveness for his failures. Despite everything he had done to them, despite the fear and pain he had caused, she felt an unexpected stab of grief for the man he might have been before alcohol and disappointment had poisoned his soul. "These are the legal documents establishing my guardianship," Thomas continued, holding out the paper toward Clara. "I've already spoken with the city attorney's office. They're quite concerned about the irregularity of the current arrangement. 3 white children being raised by a Negro man? Surely you can understand how inappropriate that appears to decent society." Clara's spine straightened, and Sarah recognized the warning signs of her adoptive mother's rarely displayed but formidable temper. "Mr. Levy, these children have been through enough trauma. They are happy, healthy, and thriving in our care. Whatever legal documents you may have, I suggest you speak with our attorney before making any precipitous moves." Thomas stepped closer to the doorway, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "Mrs. Hoy, I don't think you understand the gravity of the situation. I am these children's legal guardian now, by right of blood and by law. You can hand them over willingly, or I can return with the police and take them by force. Either way, they're coming with me today." It was then that Sarah made her second crucial decision in the space of a year. She slipped through the side door of the mission house and positioned herself in the front room where she could hear every word of the conversation while remaining hidden from Thomas's view. Eli and Annie looked up from their blocks with curiosity, but she pressed her finger to her lips and gestured for them to remain quiet. "And what exactly do you plan to do with 3 children?" Clara was asking, her Irish accent thickening with emotion as it always did when she was upset. "Do you have a home prepared for them? Work that will support them? Any experience caring for children who have survived trauma?" Thomas laughed, and the sound made Sarah's skin crawl just as it had when she was small. "What I plan to do, Mrs. Hoy, is my business. But I can tell you this, they'll be raised properly, by people who understand their place in the natural order of things. No more of this nonsense about Negroes adopting white children. No more confusion about where they belong." "Where they belong," Clara repeated, her voice dangerously quiet, "is with people who love them and protect them and would die before seeing them harmed." "Love," Thomas snorted. "What does love have to do with anything? These are practical matters, Mrs. Hoy. Legal matters. Blood matters. And the blood that runs in those children's veins is Levy blood. not whatever misguided charity you've been offering them. Sarah had heard enough. She gestured for Eli and Annie to follow her toward the back of the house, moving as silently as she had learned during their escape from their father's apartment. They needed to get word to Samuel at the shipyard, needed to contact their lawyer, needed to prepare for what was clearly going to be another battle for their right to remain together as a family. But as she helped her siblings climb out the rear window onto the fire escape, Sarah caught sight of something that chilled her blood. Thomas Levy was not alone. Waiting in a carriage at the end of the block were two other men, and even from a distance, she could see that they were not the type of people who resolved disputes through legal channels. Their peace had been shattered, and Sarah understood with perfect clarity that this time, the threat they faced was far more dangerous than her father's drunken violence. Thomas Levy had come prepared for war, and he intended to win at any cost. As they made their way down the fire escape and into the maze of alleys that Sarah knew better than any adult, she could hear Clara's voice rising in the distance, no longer diplomatic but fierce with protective fury. "Mr. Levy, I suggest you leave our property immediately. These children are not going anywhere with you, today or any other day." Thomas's response was too quiet for Sarah to hear, but his tone carried across the space between buildings like a promise of violence. She grabbed Eli and Annie's hands and began to run, knowing that their survival once again depended on staying one step ahead of men who saw them not as children deserving of love and protection, but as property to be claimed and controlled. The war for their family was beginning again, and this time, Sarah understood that everything they had built together was at stake. 5 years later, on a warm September afternoon that smelled of apple cider and wood smoke, Sarah Levy, now Sarah Hoy in all the ways that mattered, stood in the expanded courtyard behind the mission house and marveled at how much their world had grown. The confrontation with Thomas Levy had ended not with violence, as she had feared, but with a revelation that had changed everything. The legal documents he had carried were forgeries, created by a man whose gambling debts had driven him to attempt kidnapping his own brother's children for ransom. The truth had emerged during a tense standoff that lasted 3 days, with Clara refusing to surrender the children and Samuel arriving home from the shipyard to find his wife standing on their front porch with his old army rifle across her knees. Samuel's military connections had proved invaluable in uncovering Thomas's deception, and when the real authorities finally sorted through the mess of false documents and fraudulent claims, Thomas Levy had found himself facing charges of attempted kidnapping and fraud. But that crisis, terrifying as it had been, was now just a memory that served to underscore how far they had all come. The mission house had been expanded twice more, first to accommodate the steady stream of children who found their way to their door, and later to include a proper workshop where Maisie's sewing business had grown into a thriving enterprise that employed 6 women from the neighborhood. Sarah, now 13 and tall for her age, had inherited Clara's fierce protectiveness and Samuel's quiet strength, but she had added her own qualities to the mix. A quick intelligence that impressed her teachers and a natural leadership ability that made other children look to her for guidance. She had become the bridge between the adult world and the world of children, translating needs and fears in both directions with a skill that came from years of experience. Eli, at 11, had discovered a gift for working with wood that rivaled Samuel's craftsmanship. His small hands could carve intricate details that brought joy to children throughout the Lower East Side, and his wooden toys had become so popular that Samuel had begun teaching him the business side of their informal workshop. The shy, frightened boy who had once cowered under kitchen tables had grown into a confident young man who measured his words carefully but spoke with authority when he chose to speak at all. Annie, now 9, had blossomed into the family's storyteller and dreamer. She read voraciously, devouring every book she could find and creating elaborate tales that she would act out for the younger children who cycled through their household. Her gift for languages had made her invaluable in their diverse neighborhood, where she could speak with Italian children in their native tongue and help Polish mothers navigate the English-speaking world of schools and social services. Maisie's daughter Rose had grown into a precocious 4-year-old who treated the mission house like her personal kingdom, commanding attention from everyone with her bright smile and endless questions. She had never known her biological father, but she had been surrounded by so much love from Samuel, Clara, and her extended family of siblings that she showed no signs of feeling deprived. The courtyard celebration that September afternoon was nominally in honor of the 5th anniversary of the court ruling that had made their family official, but it had evolved into something much larger. A community gathering that brought together all the lives that had been touched by the radical experiment in love that Clara and Samuel had begun. Former residents of the mission house, now grown and independent, returned with their own children to share food and stories. Neighbors who had initially been suspicious of the interracial household had become friends and supporters, contributing to the celebration with dishes that reflected the incredible diversity of their community. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly boarding house owner who had testified on Clara's behalf years earlier, sat in a place of honor at the long table Samuel had built from salvaged ship timber. Dr. Cohen, who had documented the children's injuries and recovery, regaled a group of young people with stories of medical advances that were making life better for poor families throughout the city. Miss Sullivan, the schoolteacher who had tracked their progress, beamed with pride as she watched Sarah lead a group of younger children in a complex game that seemed to involve equal parts imagination and mathematics. But perhaps the most remarkable presence at the celebration was that of Officer Murphy, the Irish cop who had been forced to mediate their initial confrontation with Jeb Levy. He had arrived in civilian clothes, carrying a carefully wrapped package that turned out to contain a small Irish harp that had belonged to his grandmother. "For the music," he said gruffly, presenting it to Clara with obvious embarrassment at his own sentimentality. "Every proper Irish household needs music." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she accepted the gift, understanding the deeper meaning behind Murphy's gesture. In a city where Irish immigrants and free blacks were often pitted against each other for the same jobs and the same small measures of respect, his presence at their celebration represented a kind of reconciliation that extended far beyond their individual family. As the afternoon wore on and the shadows grew longer, Sarah found herself standing slightly apart from the festivities, watching the scene unfold with the observational skills that had kept her family safe during their darkest days. What she saw filled her with a contentment that was deeper than happiness. Children of different races and backgrounds playing together without conscious awareness of their differences. Adults sharing food and laughter despite the barriers that the outside world tried to place between them. And at the center of it all, Clara and Samuel moving through the crowd with the quiet satisfaction of people who had achieved something truly extraordinary. Maisie approached her during one of these contemplative moments, Rose balanced on her hip and a knowing smile on her face. "You're thinking serious thoughts for someone at a party," she observed. Sarah smiled back, her gaze returning to the celebration. "I was thinking about how it all started," she said. 5 years ago, I thought family was something you were born into, something you were stuck with whether it was good or bad. I thought love was scarce, something that had to be rationed and protected because there might not be enough to go around. And now," Maisie prompted, "now I know that family is something you choose to create every single day," Sarah replied. "And love isn't scarce at all. The more you give away, the more you have." As if to illustrate her point, Annie appeared at her elbow, tugging on her sleeve with the urgency that 9-year-olds bring to all their communications. "Sarah, come quick." Eli finished the new dollhouse and Rose won't let anyone else see it first. Sarah laughed and allowed herself to be pulled back into the celebration, back into the beautiful chaos of a family that had been built not through blood or law but through choice and commitment and the radical belief that love could conquer even the darkest circumstances. Later that evening, after the last guests had departed and the dishes had been washed and put away, the core family gathered in their living room for their traditional end-of-day reflection. It was a ritual Clara had instituted years earlier, a time for each person to share something they had learned or experienced that day. "I learned that Murphy's grandmother was a harpist in County Cork," Clara said, running her fingers over the strings of her new instrument and producing a cascade of silvery notes. "I learned that Rose has very definite opinions about dollhouse furniture arrangement," Eli contributed, earning a round of laughter from everyone who had witnessed the afternoon's dramatic negotiations. "I learned a new Italian song from Mrs. Benedetto," Annie added, immediately launching into a melody that had everyone humming along within moments. When it came to Sarah's turn, she looked around the circle at the faces that had become her world. Clara with her red hair now touched with silver, Samuel with the patient strength that had never wavered, Maisie with Rose sleeping peacefully in her arms, her siblings who had grown from frightened children into confident young people, and all the others who made their extended family complete. "I learned," Sarah said slowly, that the best stories don't end. They just keep growing, adding new chapters and new characters, becoming richer and more complex with every passing year. Samuel nodded approvingly, understanding as he always did the deeper meaning behind her words. "And what do you think the next chapter of our story will bring?" Sarah smiled, her gaze moving to the window where the lights of the city twinkled like earthbound stars. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I know we'll face it together, whatever it is. And I know that no matter how big our family grows or how many people we welcome into our home, there will always be room for one more." Outside, the sounds of the Lower East Side continued their eternal symphony. Children calling to each other in the gathering dusk, women singing lullabies in a dozen different languages, men returning home from their labors with tired bodies but hopeful hearts. It was the sound of America itself, Sarah realized, not the America of grand speeches and noble ideals, but the America of ordinary people choosing every day to build something better than what they had inherited. And in their small corner of that vast, chaotic, beautiful experiment, Sarah Hoy and her chosen family continued to prove that love, applied with enough persistence and courage, could indeed transform the world one child at a time.